today I have with me author Susan Meissner, and this is Susan's newest book. She has written many books, but this is her newest book, and it's called A Bridge Across the Ocean. I love this book, Susan. I couldn't wait to talk to you about this. It is the only one. You have written so many books, and when I was going through your library of books, I was like, oh my God, I have to read these. I mean, I can't even. I'm like, okay, where am I going to start with this? But first of all, I love this book. I love the way you write. It is amazing. So
thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. It's nice. Affirmation is great. Thank you.
Yeah, and what I love about you is that you're kind of like me. I mean, you've raised 4 children. I've raised 6 children. Okay, and it's like we come at this point of like my youngest is 14, but my oldest is 30, and you start to think like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I know how to do that, but what else am I going to do? And I love that you started, this journey and after you raised your kids to start writing and putting all your efforts in there, because we do have to figure out as moms, especially when we've had a lot of children, not to say that with 2 children it's the same. It's just that we've been doing it a long time,
Exactly, right.
So even if some of my kids are like bumped up against each other and some of them have more spaces, but either way, it's like, my oldest is 30, so I've been doing this for 30 years, and that is just like, what I've been doing this
Yeah, I didn't write my first book until I was 42, which looking back now, I think for a writer especially, you have to have lived a little bit of life before you really have the insight to write about it. At least for me, I feel like if I had started earlier, I might have been able to pull off a few good books maybe, because I know there are plenty of people in their 20s and 30s who write masterful books. But I don't know if I could have done it because I didn't have the insight that life gave me. So really, my 40s were for me the best time for me to start writing books.
Yeah, and I love, like I said, it's so inspirational for women, because I think that we hit our mid-40s and we're like, what am I going to do? What am I good at? What does my resume look like at this point?
Yeah, right.
And it's awesome to find something that you love so much that can fill that void and give you like a breath of new life. Like, oh wow, this gets to be, the other thing that I do, and you do it so well.
Thank you.
This being the only book I've read of yours, and I was just last night I had the temptation, because I read a lot of books, so I kind of sometimes I'm listening to audiobooks, I'm on my Kindle, I'm all over the place, and I was like, oh my God, I want to see how this ends, and I'm never one to go to the end of a book, and I was like, don't do it, just keep reading.
I'm glad you didn't skip to the end, because this is really one of those books where you don't want to do that. So well done, good for you, congratulations.
And I don't get that. Like I said, I don't do that. I'd never do that. I really don't. I don't do that. But the urge to do it was so intense that I was like shocked at because I couldn't figure out how you were going to end this. I couldn't figure it out. Sometimes you get to the halfway through it and you're like, oh, I get it. I know what's going to happen. But okay, so I have so many questions. And
awesome.
I don't do spoilers. So there's going to be nothing that, I will not ask you any questions that's going to ruin anything for anybody. Okay. But when you were so historical fiction is almost like my favorite thing to read. I learned so much, and I learned so much about the Queen Mary, and I love that on this cover that you have that there. That is so beautiful. I mean, look at your cover. It is just beautiful.
It is beautiful. I totally agree, and I have nothing to do with the cover, so I can say that and not sound uppity, because I had nothing to do with it.
But it's beautiful. You're really blessed, because sometimes the covers don't come out as well. But this, when I got it in the mail, I was like, wow. I just love the cover. So when you were doing your research, and you're in Southern California, and the Queen Mary is there, right? I was doing a little bit of research myself, and I was like, oh, so is it still off of Long Beach?
Yeah, in fact, it's been in Long Beach longer than it ever sailed. Her maiden voyage was in 1936, and she sailed until the late 60s. So really, she was only a sailing vessel for less than 40 years, and she's been in Long Beach almost 50 years as a floating hotel. And I actually went up there thinking, I wonder if this would make a good setting for a novel, because I was on a search for a new idea, and I thought, she's right here. If I wanted to do research, I could go up as many times as I wanted. And so it was that first day that I went up there just looking, kind of, scoping it out. And there were so many good ideas aboard the ship. and one of them, of course, was the War Brides, which I hadn't heard much about, and that interested me greatly. And then I found out that the ship is haunted. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, I wasn't even sure if I did, but as a fiction writer, I get to imagine whatever I want. So it was easy for me to imagine that ghosts are real and that they are on the Queen Mary, and that if I was going to have war brides and ghosts together in one book, it had to be a really special premise that brought them together. Not scary. I wouldn't call this a scary book at all.
No.
But I mean, there are ghosts in it, but they are like the mortal characters in the book who want something and they don't have it, and they're driven to pursue it. Every good book you read is about somebody who wants something and they go after it, and they're either going to get it or they're not. And that's the same premise I took with my fictional ghosts, is that they were just like the mortal characters who wanted something and had to go after it.
And I love that that she doesn't take on the ability to see ghosts like easily. And her name is Brett.
Brett, yeah. My current day character it has an ability. She can see people who haven't crossed over, and I made it kind of a. I mean, I didn't do a lot of research actually on the paranormal for this book, because I started to, and it was really kind of scary and dark. And I didn't want to go there because my book is really affirming, life affirming. Yes. And so I kind of made up my own rules about ghosts. And so I made up this gifting, which may or may not be real. Maybe somebody actually does have this gift, but I didn't research it, in that she can see the souls and the people who, for whatever reason, just don't cross over. And they're hanging around and they're afraid. They're afraid to cross over. And so she's able to see them and really wishes that she couldn't. It kind of messes up her life. And so she's on a struggle. I mean, her struggle is to figure out, how am I going to live with this ability, because I can't stop it. It's not going anywhere. And she's afraid to have children because she's afraid of passing it on. So that's her little nut to crack in this book.
Yes. I love that about her. I loved her name, as a matter of fact, even though I was like, wait, how can I not remember it? But that's the thing. It's such a unique name. I love when you have characters that have, because it gives them a personality that is unique. It gave her, I felt like it gave her another dimension of what to love about her.
Oh, and, nice. Thanks.
Yeah, I really did. And I was thinking the same thing, because, I've talked to a lot of people in the paranormal, that write books. And I was like, I really kind of guessed that you made it up, because I was like, you know what? This is unique and different and not scary. I did think that way. I was like, this is so a not scary way of going about it. You made it like it's this gift. And she doesn't know exactly what to do with it, and she's scared, but she faces it, and then she, which I also loved. I loved her facing her fear.
Nice. Thanks.
I love that ability. So, okay, about the War Brides, because I have been reading a lot of World War II historical fiction, just because, I don't know if you've noticed, but really, a lot have been coming out. Yeah,
I think what happened is we had a kind of an anniversary in 2015. It was an anniversary of VE Day. The war ended in May of '45, so 2015 was an anniversary year, and we all kind of knew it. And so a lot of us had books that came out with a World War II theme, and of course, All the Light We Cannot See and The Nightingale were two amazingly written World War II books, and they kind of bumped up that desire and hunger for World War II fiction, and so it hasn't abated. Even now, we're coming up on 2018, if people are still wanting stories from that time period.
Yeah, and I actually, everyone that I've read in the last 6 months has taken on such a unique, different story that I don't get tired of it. So,
There are a lot of World War II stories out there that haven't been told because it was just so big. I mean, we're talking about the world, and so it's more than just what happened at the concentration camps, and all those stories definitely deserve to be told. But there are other stories, and so we're finding out more and more of them.
And that's what I was thinking when I read this. I was like, why didn't I ever think of the War Brides? I never heard stories about what happened once they met. And I was also I was married to a man who was in the Marine Corps. I was stationed in Southern California for many years, and then to Andrews Air Force Base. So I was a part of the military, and then I had 2 sons in the military. So I was a part of the military community pretty extensively. But I never thought about that. I never thought, and this story brought that to life. Of course they were meeting spouses, and then what happened, with them. So it's interesting to me is that there was enough, like it wasn't just unusual. There were so many that they needed a ship to keep.
Oh, there were thousands of European war brides. I think there were 20,000 in Britain alone.
Wow.
And that doesn't even count the ones, on the continent and in Australia, wherever we had Allied soldiers for any length of time, training, they fell in love and married women who lived right there. And so, in Britain alone, I think it was upwards of 20,000 women.
And you know what I always think about is like with technology today, that would not be a difficult thing. But what these women had to go through in waiting for letters and figuring out, like, can you imagine like getting a letter that's probably a month, it took a month to get, and then you're supposed to be at a ship. I mean, it's hard to imagine.
It was a very complicated process because, first of all, they couldn't even get married there was a red tape to get through to get married because you had to have your commander's permission to marry a foreign, gal from wherever you were stationed. And they did that because in World War I, the same thing was happening. American Canadian soldiers were falling in love with European women and marrying them, and they already had wives back home in the U.S. And so after World War I, there were all these displaced European women who their husbands left, and that was it. And so they said, that's not going to happen this time. And so they made it, though, so that if you wanted to marry a European woman, you had to have your commander's permission because he would know if you had already a wife back home. And so it was complicated.
Right.
It could take upwards of a month just to get permission to marry.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. And these women like waited. Some of them had babies. Some of them,
Yeah, because the war technically ended in Europe, in June of 45, and the first Queen Mary crossing wasn't until February of 1946. So that's almost a whole year after the war ended that those first war brides were able to get, immigrated over to the United States. It was a big process.
And I bet. Well, I'm sure you know from research that there were a lot that didn't, those guys did have wives and they were.
Yeah, I'm sure there were lots of sad stories. And I do know that the war bride that I interviewed multiple times for this book, June Allen, she's the person the book is dedicated to. She told me all kinds of stories of what it was like to cross over on the Queen Mary. And she said on her ship and on every other voyage that the Queen Mary made for the war brides, there were always 2 or 3 women who wouldn't get off the ship. They chickened out. They went right back. So they didn't get off the ship. I don't know what happened to those marriages because they didn't go. They didn't get off the ship, and that happened every single time the Queen Mary made that crossing. So I'm sure there were some unhappy stories too among all the happy ones.
Right. Well, I think it's awesome that you were able to interview. I mean, these people are not, like we're losing. World War II veterans and people.
It's true. Yeah.
Quickly,
Yeah. The war bride that I interviewed was 18 when she made the crossing, and she's going to be 90 this year. And so you're right. We're, a lot of those, the people that witnessed that era are, they're dying out. So it's probably another reason why there's such a hunger and demand for World War II stories because the witnesses are aging out and dying.
And people are realizing that for interviewing or any kind of research they're going to do, they better do it now, basically.
Right, exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. I remember my grandmother telling me, now, of course, she had cousins, and so I didn't have anybody directly, like I didn't have a grandfather or anybody in World War II, but she had cousins, and she told me that one of her cousins came back with a woman's name tattooed on his arm, and he was married.
Oh, no. Oops.
His wife was like, who is that? And he was like, oh, it's nothing. Like, nothing. Like,
dear.
So I'm sure there were lots of crazy stories like that. That wasn't very smart on his part. But.
No, I'm sure he probably had one too many at the pub.
Right, exactly. So was this the only, you've had, 14 or 15 books now? Right?
Yeah, I think this one might be 18. There's it's because a lot of my early books aren't in print anymore, and so they're harder to find. I'm getting them. I'm getting the rights back to all of those, and I'm slowly getting them back up onto electronic book platforms. But I think I'm on 18. This one might be number 18.
Are you writing about a book a year?
that's what it's been. In the beginning, I was writing 2 a year. I was very motivated. They were shorter books back then. And they were contemporary fiction, which takes a lot less research. And so I was able to write 2 books a year because they were shorter and they were contemporary. But now that I'm writing historical fiction and I'm writing for the general market and the books are, 100, 120,000 words, those take longer. And the research part, of course, is almost as lengthy as the writing part. So now it is 1 a year, and even that is beginning to seem a little daunting. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep up that pace. Right now, it's 1 a year, and there is one coming out in 2018. We'll see what happens in 2019.
Well, when you read historical fiction, you always know that the characters are usually fictitious, but then there's history woven into and I was wondering, were all the characters fictitious in this one?
They were. I wanted to have complete freedom to do what I wanted with my characters, and I feel like when you involve a real person, you are obligated to uphold their real history, and I didn't want those limitations. And so even my British war bride, who I have on the ship, her name is Phoebe in the book. She's not June. She's not the British war bride that I interviewed, time and time again for this book. I borrowed a lot of what June told me and gave it to Phoebe, the character, but Phoebe is not June. And that way I didn't have to mirror June's life or reveal anything about her life that doesn't need to be made public, that kind of thing. So my 3 war brides are fictional. The gal in San Diego who can see these people that don't cross over, she's fictional. And really all that happens around them is real. But the people in the book are people who I imagined being in a very real situation.
Well, I love that you write about something that I'd never heard of. That's what I loved about this book, is that it brought in, and I was like, I never heard of it. And then, then I was like, wait, I think I did hear. How you think well, maybe I heard something about it, but now I feel like I know so much more about it, and I love that. And what book did you write after this one? Can you talk about it at all?
Yeah, it's pretty much done. I'm just doing the last edits that I can do for this book. I'm doing now, which means they're very, very small. I'm not allowed really to make big sweeping changes anymore because it's going to be going into review copies in July, and they'll start sending out review copies. And it's called As Bright as Heaven. And it's set in 1918, and the book comes out in 2018. So I purposely wrote this book for the centennial of the Spanish flu outbreak because when I was researching a new book idea, I was looking to see what's coming up anniversary-wise in 2018, and I knew that the Spanish flu was something that happened then. And the more I read about it, the more I realized it's an untold story. It's really millions of untold stories because it didn't get the press that we would give it now. More people died of Spanish flu in 1918 than in World War I, World War II, the Gulf War, Korean War, all of those wars combined.
Isn't that crazy?
It's upwards of 50 million people worldwide. It's the most deadly epidemic in all history, and yet few people know about it. And I think the reason why is because it was happening at the same time as World War I, and nobody wanted to admit in the press, in public, how many of their citizens and soldiers were dying of Spanish flu. So it just wasn't talked about very much. The press, the stories were below the fold. They were small one-column stories, and I think it's because they weren't being given information about how bad it was, because then your enemies the enemies you were fighting would know how decimated your troops would be. And the reason why it was called Spanish flu is because Spain was neutral during World War I, and so it had nothing to gain or lose by being honest with how deadly this disease was. And so they reported everything, how many people were dying. And so it got dubbed with the name Spanish flu because it seemed like it was happening more in Spain, but it wasn't. It was happening everywhere, but no one else was talking about it the way Spain was able to be honest about it.
That's crazy. I can tell you a Spanish flu story. So
yeah.
My grandfather, he took I was in my teen years, and he took me to the cemetery, and he said, I'd never met his mom. Okay. She died very shortly before I was born, but I never met her. And he showed me 5 tombstones, and he said, my mom lost 5 girls in 1 year from the Spanish flu. It was between 1917 and 1919, or like it was all 5 of her daughters. And he was born in 1918, and then he had 2 brothers that survived it. So she lost her daughter. She had 8 children, but she lost all her daughters.
That's just heartbreaking.
I named my one daughter after her because I never knew her, but she was a Christian woman with a lot of faith, and I used to say to him, how do you do that? Like, how do you do that? How do you go on? He said she was the happiest person, and he said she just hung on to her faith, and that's what got her through. And I was always like mesmerized by this woman that I did not know, that especially once I started having children. Okay. Yeah. It took on a new meaning of like, how did those parents do it? Because a lot of it was the children that were dying, So.
Yeah. In my story, I chose Philadelphia. I mean, I could have picked any city, any big city in America because it was everywhere. Right. But I picked Philadelphia because it was one of the harder hit cities in Philadelphia. And I gave the story to a family, 3 daughters, and their father is an undertaker. So he's,
oh my God,
what happens in their home, because they live above the funeral home, they have a very unique perspective on what is happening to their town, to their city rather. And the daughters are young, they're 15, 13, and 7. And so they're telling the story of what is happening. And so part of the story is during the flu, it's 1918. And then the second part of the story is 1925, when they're all like, they're in their mostly adult years. The youngest is only 14, but now they're living with how that experience informs my adult life. When you go through something like that, it's going to have an effect on your thinking, the way you think about life and death and what is precious and what you're willing to do to hang on to hope. All those things that they experienced as girls is now informing their present. And you're right. One of the best questions we can ask when something like that happens is, how do you survive? How do you go on? And that's pretty much what I do in the book.
Yeah. And I think what's awesome about historical fiction, even for, my children. I've homeschooled my children, and I use historical fiction to tell stories. And that's the thing. It's like some kids don't want to open up a textbook and been like, okay, 1942. Like historical fiction I've always used as a way of teaching. Because it gives it life. It gives about
I
people,
agree. I do. It gives the story, or it gives the historical account, the humanity, because history is always about people. And of course, a novel is about the people that experienced history rather than history being read, by people.
Yeah. So that's what I love it for. And I know all my homeschooling mom people that are out there, like they love that too. So, I'm always very grateful that there are women like you that are out there, and other, not men too, that are out there writing these stories, because they're important, and they're important to pass down. And this is a great way to pass them down.
I agree. Yeah. It's my favorite thing to read is historical fiction for that reason, is I feel like I'm learning, but I'm learning in the vehicle of story. So it's just an enjoyable way to learn.
Yeah. So it's like fun, because when you're doing this research and then you get to write about it, I mean, that is a lot of fun. Do you have any advice for anybody, for like a new writer who's out there and, historical fiction is what they want to do? Do you have any good advice for them?
I guess the best advice I could give a aspiring writer is just, don't give up, keep writing. Sometimes the process can be slow, and sometimes if you want to break out, the timing isn't quite right. It doesn't mean you're not a good writer or you don't have a good idea. It just might mean that the timing isn't right. And so it's just keep writing. Remember that every time you write, you're exercising your writing muscle. And Michael Phelps spent a lot of years swimming laps in a pool when no one was watching, but he was developing his great skill, and eventually now he's the most decorated swimmer in Olympic history. And so it starts out with swimming laps in a pool when no one's watching. So just keep writing. Don't get into despair if it seems like nothing is happening. Sometimes it's not your book first that sells; it's your second one. So if you've written a book that no one seems to want, start writing book number 2 and see where that takes you, because it might be that book 2 is the book that's gonna be the one that gets you out into the public eye.
That's awesome. And I know your children are so blessed to be able to see their mom do this. I mean, you're amazing. And I can't wait until your next book. And I hope we can talk about it because
thanks.
I will be reading it. But for now, this has just come out. This book is amazing. Go buy it if you love reading World War II historical fiction. This is perfect. So thank you so much. I will have all of Susan's links. You can find her everywhere. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed being here. Thank you so much.
Awesome. We'll talk to you soon, Susan.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.